Well, it's already week 3 for the semester for spring. So glad that you're following along with this. Hopefully, learning some great things from this semester. So to begin, let's talk about the Mongol Empire. Let's get into that class. We had a little bit of a shortened class this week just because we did a game that we played in class. It was kind of a fun game. But let's talk about this empire for a little bit here. So the Mongols, as we mentioned last week, that they're nomadic, they move around. The idea of having a standing army and a family are it's just interesting because when you live in this harsh climate, when you have to look for anything around you for food, you're literally living off the animals that you are raising. So the grasslands are really good to raise the animals, and then you live off the animals, which is a lot of meat, and you don't want to eat the meat too fast because then you run out of animals, and that's going to be bad for the future. So you ration your meat. You don't eat a lot of it. But if you try to find water, if you can't find water, then you literally drink the blood of your animals. And they were not opposed to even the horses that they're riding. If their horses get too tired or start having problems, they just slaughter them and eat them. They ate everything. They ate mice, they ate rats. There's rumors that the Mongols would even eat lice and other insects and bugs. They ate whatever they could to help them to stay alive and survive. They're very hardy people. They didn't let things go to waste. They used everything up they could. It's not an easy place to live, and so if it was, there'd have been a lot more people there. That it wasn't an easy place to live, and so they moved around a lot, and sometimes had to invade other tribes to get supplies and things. It was kind of every man for himself type idea. So they're a tough people, really tough people. They are, of course, having all these other challenges because other nations are, like China was like, let's just keep them hating each other. If they don't like each other, they're not going to bother us. Well, Ghengis changes that. As he grows up, he learns from being abjectly poor. I mean, Mongol life is about being poor anyways, but when you have no tribe necessarily to work with for a while, it was a long time before he had to work his way back into the tribe, into the Mongol family basically, because his mom and his siblings were all kicked out. And then they were later, as he became a warrior, they're like, hey, this guy's a fighter, let's bring him back in. Then they started to bring him back in, him and his brothers. And then he rose to be the ruler of the Mongol tribe because he was so good at what he did. He was fearless, he was not afraid to get into battle, and he won a lot. He was really successful. And then he realizes we need to do more to build ourselves up to improve. So he has a lot of good common sense. Usually when we think of Genghis Khan, we think, he was a murderer. He fathered a tremendous amount of children. In fact, at the height of the Mongolian Empire, as far as the conquests went, they believed that at the height of that empire, which we're going to talk more about those conquests here in a minute, that 50% of these conquests were huge. Like 50% of the world's population was inside Genghis Khan's empire at some point. Basically, this big Mongolian empire. And I think today they say like 1 out of every 7 adult males in the world have some ancestry connected back to Genghis Khan. It's just phenomenal. Like they said he had like 6, what they say, 6, he had 6 servant girls that would come into his yurt every day. And it's like, wow, this dude was busy. But the thing that's interesting about this group is he rallies these tribes together. He's like, let's band together, let's help each other out, let's work together. And he starts to pull the tribes together. The tribes that won't, they fight, they end up capturing them, taking them, and bringing them as prisoners, making them slaves, or willing to work with them as well, and become part of this larger group. So what Genghis Khan did first was take all these different tribes that were running around the steppes of Asia, and he unified them. So he ended up creating, in a way, an ethnicity. he pulled them all together and said, now you're Mongol. Now you are all one family, basically. And he intermingled them so that they weren't tribes, and one tribe was one army, another tribe was another army. He intermingled them so they couldn't go back to their old tribal ways. They were intermingled as a unified group of being Mongol. So the Mongol family went from being just a family tribe to basically an ethnicity, as practically like a nation. And he unified them, and then he started to go out from there. He started to conquer other groups and do other things. Now that he had this huge group, he was a force to be reckoned with. One of the early parts of the conquest, in fact, you can really break the conquest into 3 sections. The first section is the early days of Mongol conquest. Genghis Khan started sending out emissaries to other nations to start to do trade and do things with other nations. China, they had already had some interactions with, and so China wasn't very happy about this. They've been trying to prevent these tribal groups from coming together to be a formidable force, and so they ended up going to war with China. They ended up taking over, I think it was the Jin Empire in China. Jin Dynasty was the one that was taken over, and then the Song Dynasty, which was southern China, stayed. They were able to keep the Mongols back for a little while. And so after the Jin dynasties, the Yuan dynasty is the Mongol dynasty of China. And they were there for like 150 years or something. They're there for quite a while anyways. And then they eventually got in the third wave of conquest, they ended up taking the Song dynasty as well, and taking all of China for the Yuan dynasty. But while this is happening, while Mongolians are fighting against the Chinese and dealing with those groups over there in the east, Genghis Khan sends some emissaries down into the Sultanate areas, down into like Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq area. And there was I wish I could remember the guy's name right now, Khwarazand. It was that area of the world. He sends a couple emissaries down to deal with them. The guy, the ruler of this group, he was a Muslim ruler of this area, a little bit after I think the Abbasid Empire, in fact, as that was starting to kind of struggle and have some issues, this guy didn't take the Mongol emissaries seriously. In fact, I think they ended up like shaving them bald, which beards was a sign of power. They shaved him bald. They sent him back. They like beat him up, or they were not really nice to the emissaries. And Genghis took offense at this and said, "This is dumb. If you're going to treat my emissaries this way, we're going to come fight you." And so he moves his army down to this area of the world and just destroys them. Gets down to, I think, Samarkand was the name of their capital, and just obliterates them. Like, they don't even stand a chance. And it's so bad. In fact, he made them an example. He destroyed them so bad that he left just enough people alive to spread the word to the other cities that when the Mongols show up, they are no mercy, no holds barred. You're done for. And they were able to just march through places. Now, of course, this is after, again, they had several fights with China. They started learning from China about siege engines and other tactics and other things to help out to deal with sedentary lifestyles, because they're used to fighting on an open steppe. There is no fortresses. There's just you guys running around and doing things. And so they had different strategies. And so they learned how to address the challenges of attacking a sedentary community. So a sedentary community is one where you stay put. You have a house, you live there, you have your business, all your livelihood is within the city. You don't have to leave the city very much, because they had to migrate. They had to move around and have these yurts, these mobile homes, basically, to help them to keep their stuff there. And so they moved all the time. And so it's just some different tactics and strategies they had to use. So they obliterated Samarkand. They just went down there and started marching through the whole area and taking over a lot of the Middle East. I think it was around the 1250s. In the second wave, they ended up getting Baghdad. getting that far down to the Euphrates River as well, down through into India, the Indus River area, Indus River Valley, get through that area. So what we would call today Pakistan and Kashmir and those areas, they got down to those parts, nearly into India itself, but they didn't necessarily get into India a lot. That was a later Mongol group of Muslims that the Mughal Empire that went down that way after the main Mongol Empire happened. And this is in the 1200s A.D. Okay, now that's important. A lot of times you think, oh, all the ancient stuff happened in BC. No, this is 1200 A.D. Genghis Khan did his stuff 600 years ago. Or not 800 years ago, excuse me. 800 years ago was when he did his stuff. So it's, I mean, if you think about it, we look at like the Old Testament, which we're going to talk about because of the ancient Near Eastern class that I have. That class, we're talking in like 3000 BC time frame and stuff, not 1200 AD. So this is relatively young. The Mongol Empire is a relatively young period of time. So it's pretty interesting. It's around similar to the time of the Crusades that were happening as well. So that's the kind of put it in that time frame of the rest of history. So Europe is well developed by this point. The Holy Roman Empire happens. In fact, the schism of the three popes is happening around that same time as well. So that's kind of where you think of where Europe is at the time the Mongols are coming through, basically. Such a wild time, just an interesting time to be around when these Mongols came through. So the second wave was around 1255 time frame, and this is a little bit of Genghis Khan plus some of it, the princes, some of the other leaders underneath Genghis Khan. His sons were out helping to conquer more. When they did, so the first push kind of went through. They hit down into Afghanistan, Iran area. They started pushing further west a little ways, more what we would call like Western Russia area. They went into China. They had northern China, and they were starting to get into southern China. And then in 1255, they took over the rest of all of southern China. They actually had a small few campaigns by boat down to Sumatra. Is that they tried to get down there. The Mongols didn't like boat warfare, using boats and stuff. They're more land creatures, so they didn't. That didn't go so well down there. But the Mongols actually did try to go to Japan as well. They had heard after invading China in that area and eventually getting over into Korea and those places. They heard about Japan, and so they said, let's go conquer Japan. So they set sail to go conquer Japan, and a massive typhoon came. They timed their invasion of Japan with a massive typhoon coming in. And this typhoon actually got the name of kamikaze. And that's where the concept of the kamikaze came from, actually, is because it was the Mongols trying to invade Japan, and then this typhoon comes in and just obliterates what the Mongol fleet, basically, and they can't get to Japan because the typhoon's pushing them back to China and destroying their boats and things, and so they never get to China, or never get to Japan, basically. But that typhoon was called Typhoon Kamikaze, and after the Japanese name, and so that's where we get a lot of the ideas of like in World War II, the kamikaze pilots, those kinds of things come from that story, actually, from Mongolia's history. So they tried it, but they weren't very successful at that, so they kind of stuck to the land. And then later they pushed. They got all the way into Hungary. They pushed all the way to Hungary. They got down to Baghdad and the Euphrates River, so right through central Mesopotamia area. They got, and like I said, they were clear over by the Danube River, Black Sea, so they'd gone way past Ukraine, almost like it says Hungary, almost Austria time, period and things. If you know where the Danube is near Germany and things, that's where they were pushing to. And the reason that they were conquering is they believed that they had a mandate. Now, if you remember from my Chinese class, China had a concept called the mandate of heaven. whenever a new king came forward, there had to be some kind of a divine intervention or divine sign or something, usually like prosperity, abundance. Things would happen. The new king comes, there's abundance. That shows he is blessed of heaven. He has the mandate to rule from heaven. As soon as times get rough, droughts, famines happen, things like that, then a lot of people started to perceive that the ruler was no longer had the mandate of heaven, and so they'd usually kick him out and bring in somebody else that would help their society to improve and do better. Well, the Mongols believed a similar idea of this mandate of heaven. Genghis Khan was actually a religious person. And I say that because loosely because they didn't have a specific religion. They believed in like animism type ideas, like there were spirits, there were ancestors that we believed when the ancestors died that they had a spirit, but those spirits could then come still help bless your family and provide you with support and help from the unseen world. So a little bit of ancestor worship was there, some animism, meaning certain animals had totems, had powers, and represented spiritual symbols and things, which is why Genghis Khan always had a hawk with him, the spirit of the gods type idea. Not unlike Egyptians' falcon, Horus falcon, the Horus hawk, and those kinds of ideas. And they believed Mongolians believed that the sky was heaven. That's where God was. God was just a part of the sky. And so they worshiped the sky because that's where God was. God was everywhere, basically. He could see everything. He could be everywhere. He knew everything. And they worshiped him. And so there were several stories where Genghis would go up into the mountains. He'd go up in the hills to meditate and pray. He would seek wisdom, come back down. He believed he had a mandate from heaven to conquer the entire world, to cover all the known world, which was Asia, Europe, possibly down into Africa, although they never made it that far. They all the landmass, let's conquer them and bring all people into subjection under us. We will be the one world order that will rule everybody, and that we will provide better rules and laws and governing to help everybody live a better life. And so that was their philosophy. And that's part of why they were conquering and doing these things. So eventually they were really spread out. Now, you might ask, well, why did they not go further? Why did they not get into Africa? Why did they not take over the rest of Europe? They got into that eastern part of Europe, but they didn't get into the rest of Central and Western Europe. And here's why. As these conquests were happening, Genghis Khan eventually passes away. It's a little mysterious about his death, and then we still to this day don't even know where he's buried. The legends say that he was taken back to Mongolia, and he was buried in a sacred place, and they wanted to keep it secret. They never wanted his tomb to ever be disturbed. If you know anything about Egyptian history, you know that all the tombs were disturbed because the grave robbers, were the ones that built the tombs. And they knew when times are tough, hey, I know where there's a bunch of gold stashed for this king. He's not going to need it. Let's go raid his tomb because I helped build that tomb 10 years ago. I helped carve that into the mountainside. So they would go raid and take all that. Well, Genghis Khan didn't want his raided. He didn't want anything, not that he knew about the Egyptian stuff, but they didn't want him to be messed with. And they knew that if everybody saw where his wealth was and they would try to exhume his body and do things, and so they didn't want that. So not only did they bury him in secret, but they murdered everybody who helped bury him, and then they murdered all those murderers, and then they murdered those murderers who murdered the other people who murdered they went like 4 or 5 levels deep into this of killing people, to the point where they're just killing people because you're somehow associated with killing other people in relation to something about this. And so they got to the point where the only people that were alive didn't have any clue where he was buried. And then they kept it that way. And still to this day, we have no idea where he's at. Scientists have not been able to find him yet. Even though lots of people have tried, like Josh Gates with Expedition Unknown, a lot of others have done some TV shows about trying to find the tomb of Genghis Khan. It has never been found yet. They don't know where he's buried at. So he dies. Now, when the Khan dies, the king, what happens is they have to form. They have this meeting where they get together to basically validate who's going to be the next king. They kind of already know who he's going to be. Genghis Khan actually said, "I want my third son Ogodai to take over to be a main ruler." But then he had his other sons, and so he ended up dividing it out, saying, "When I die, we're going to divide up all this land into 4 different, basically, kingdoms, and each one of these 4 sons of his will help run parts of these kingdoms." And so that's what it was. So they had to go back. Now they're involved in wars in Eastern Europe, and they actually got down to Egypt. They got past Baghdad and Euphrates. They were fighting the Mamluks who had taken over Egypt. If you remember from my last semester from the Islam class I took, Mamluks were a group of Turkish slaves that the Islamic empire, as it grew, they took these Turkish slaves from the Afghanistan steppe area, brought them into Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, to make them an elite fighting force for the caliphate, for the ruler of the Islamic Empire. And they decided, you know what, we're strong enough, we can basically do a coup and overthrow them. So they kind of did. They ended up taking over, they're called the Mamluks. They ended up taking over Egypt and conquering Egypt and ruling Egypt. And then the Mongols came down and were fighting against them. And then suddenly they hear the news, Genghis Khan has passed away, we need to go back. So they left a part of the Mongol forces to keep fighting, while the rest of the force went back to Karakoram, the central capital at the time of the Mongol Empire, to anoint the next king, or kings, as they break up. They end up dividing up the empire into 4 of Genghis Khan's sons. And so that's what saved Europe, and that's why the Egyptians under the Mamluks, the Mamluks are one of the only nations that actually were able to be successful at defeating the Mongols. And most of it's because a majority of the Mongol army left. They stopped fighting and just left a smaller group there, and they ended up losing. So it's such an interesting reason why things happened the way they did. The plague, Black Death, started to hit Eastern and all of Europe shortly after the Mongols came through. That maybe have stopped some of the later campaigns, but not as much. So that's phase 2. Phase 3 is these 4. The nations are broken up. So Ogodei took the main empire, which was Mongolia, Korea, China, that part over there on the eastern side of the continent. Then Chagatai took the Central Asian steppe area, so he was getting places just north of like Tibet. He's getting Afghanistan, those parts of the world over that way. And then the Ilkhanate took a couple of his other sons took the Middle East, basically, and a lot of them ended up converting to Islam, becoming Muslim. And then later was the Mughal Empire that ended up invading into India and ruling in India for a while after all this happened. And then we have the Golden Horde, which took over Russia. And up in that area, Eastern Europe, Russia area, where they had conquered and done stuff over there. So it broke up into these 4 groups, and now they had to reestablish things, and they kept pushing, and that says that third wave, they kept pushing and dealing with stuff. But then we had the Black Plague in Europe. We had other challenges with those trying to get overseas, and things didn't work out and stuff like that. So it didn't really grow. It did grow some, and then it eventually started to shrink back. And that was part of the challenges that they had faced. The fighting styles of the Mongols was fascinating as well, because as they're fighting, they did all kinds of different things. Now, the problem is again, we don't have a lot of records from the Mongols themselves outside of the secret history of the Mongols, that book. So most of what we get is from other people. And they talk about when the Mongols would fight, one thing they would do is they would come into an area, they would decimate the first city, basically, and that would be the standard to remind everybody else, this is what happens if you fight us, so it's just better to surrender. If you surrender, become our servants, we won't destroy you, but you owe taxes to us and you're our slaves and things like that. Um, but you're alive. So what do you do? That was the challenge. And during Genghis Khan's life, he never lost. Like, he just kept dominating city after city, town after town, just like nonstop. It was crazy. He paid his army by the booty, so they'd invade a place, take all the spoils, and that's how he paid his soldiers. So when they started to, this was part of the challenge they ran into, is as the Mongol Empire hit a point where they weren't expanding anymore. Now they had to move to a more sedentary way of doing things. So they had to manage the empire, and that meant we're no longer conquering. So now, how do we pay our army if we're not conquering anybody else? We had to have taxes. We had to do a regular pay and other things. So administrative concepts and ideas started to come into play as they grew and did more. Not unlike what Islam had to deal with as they grew and expanded through the Middle East before the Mongols came through. And the Islamic Empire has never been the same because the Mongols destroyed it, basically, just wiped them out and broke it into smaller kingdoms and other challenges that came in later after the Abbasid Empire. So the whole empire had to go through this change and do more diplomatic stuff and work with other groups and manage a massive amount of land and people that was just huge. So a couple of the interesting things that they would do when they came into combat was, we all know the stories. They were good at their horseback. They had horses. They figured out how to use stirrups on their horses so they could literally use their feet to keep them stable while they're pivoting and turning on their horse. They would carry 3 quivers full of arrows, and they learned how to shoot while the horse is moving, how to shoot accurately. Their bows were kind of a precursor of a compound type bow. They were small, but meant to put a lot of power into it. Like, you had to be one strong dude to pull those bows back. But because of that, those arrows had a tremendous amount of energy in them. So they were piercing light armor. They could pierce light armor. They could go great distances. They were really amazing at mounted archery. Just like the whole concept of mounted archery comes from the Mongols, and they perfected it and were amazing at it. But what we don't realize is, in order to sustain the kind of movements that this army would do, each cavalry person had to have 4 horses. So they would ride into battle with 4 horses. They're riding one, 3 are in the rear, basically, because when one got tired, he would put that one in the back and pick up the next one and get on it and keep riding. And so you had to carry 4 horses if you were a cavalry person to deal with how you just had to ride hard and keep going. And so you had to keep switching horses to keep a fresh horse going, to keep your forces moving in battle. So when they showed up to battle, you just hear a thunder of all these horses, and you'd just be like, holy crap, you'd think that it was a 4 times greater army than it really was because of all the horses. And then sometimes, because they knew they had all these horses, they would actually make dummies, like straw dummies, put clothes on them and things, and put them on the horse. And so it looked like the army was 3 times bigger than it really was. As they came over the mountains and hills and down to your cities, they just it looked like their army was massive. So the numbers are overinflated when we look at the battles and the people that are reporting these battles going, oh, there must have been like 1 million Mongols. Well, of course, everybody got dominated. And so you always want it to sound like it was an overwhelming force, that you guys just weren't inept at what you're doing. So they always overinflated those numbers. But like I says, the Mongols purposely made it look like their numbers were bigger. Another tactic that they used was they would take one city and they'd get a bunch of prisoners, and then they would make those prisoners run in front of them at the next city. So while they're charging the next city over, the prisoners, the former residents of the previous city they just invaded, which are probably somewhat related to the people in this next city, similar ethnicities basically, they're on the front line coming forward, being pushed forward. And the Mongols are like, if you don't run to the city, we'll kill you. We're just going to kill you right here on the spot. So you got to keep running towards that city. So the problem is the people now are running towards the city, and the city's now shooting arrows at them to try to kill the Mongols before they reach the city. So these people did two things for the Mongols. One is they provided literally human shields for the Mongols, so the Mongols could get closer before they had to deal with the arrows from the enemy. And two, it was a psychological problem, because now you're in this city, your job is to defend the city, but the first wave of people that look like they're attacking you are your neighbors from the neighboring city. And so now you've got this conundrum: do I shoot them or do I not? If I don't shoot them to preserve their life, the Mongols that are behind them are going to get closer, and then we're going to have a harder time defending ourselves. If I do shoot them, I'm shooting my neighbors. I'm shooting people that I know. So it really, the Mongols understood psychological warfare really, really well. One of their famous strategies is retreats, strategic retreats. So the Mongols would come at you with a force. They'd usually have other forces waiting on the wings, on the sides and things. They would push a force forward. They would start to engage you in battle, and then they would start to pull back. And these people are like, oh, look, we're winning, we're pushing them back. And the Mongol Empire, this Mongol army would retreat, go up into a valley, up into, near some trees or between two hills or something. And so the city, the army at this city would be like, yay, we're pushing them back. Let's go take after them and keep fighting and killing them and keep getting rid of them. So they would fight, they would follow the Mongols. So what all the Mongols is doing is basically pulling them into an ambush. They'd draw them out. So now they're stretched out. The armies are stretched out. They're a thinner force. And then the side armies would come in and just destroy them. And then they'd go back to fighting the main armies. And they did this all the time. And a big challenge was, of course, news didn't travel super, super fast. So they could, if they just kept marching, they could hit a whole bunch of towns and use the same tactics for weeks before the other towns would realize, hey, don't follow them if they retreat, because they're going to ambush you. So they did all kinds of stuff to win. The one thing that was probably the best attribute of the Mongols is they were not prideful. They learned from everybody. They weren't like, oh yeah, we're better than you. We're not going to do it your way. We're going to do it our way. They would always learn from people. Learning to fight China, they learned about siege weapons. They learned about cannons because of gunpowder and things that the Chinese had invented. And so they adopted it. When they took over the Chinese military, they took over the Jin dynasty, they adopted it. They hired, literally the Mongols hired all the Chinese engineers that were building the siege weapons. They hired them and paid them to build them for Mongolia. And then Mongolia could now use siege weapons against other cities. So they would surround a city and literally starve you out, just like the Babylonians and Assyrians would in the ancient world. And then they would attack you when you were weak and distraught. They would build cannons, and they would launch cannonballs. They'd actually light the cannonball on fire and then throw it into the city, because most of the houses had like straw roofs and things. It burned the cities down from within by throwing these fireballs into the city. They actually would take the heads of their previous victors and they'd launch them into the next city to scare them and convince them to not fight. They actually would take dead animals that had the plague and they would launch them into these cities to encourage the plague to get everybody sick. So now they can't fight. And then they just march in and kill everybody. Basically, they were wild what they did. They were pretty merciless in their efforts to do things. So the game, let me explain the game real quick that we played, and then we'll move on to the ancient Near East. The game we played was about a man named John Carpini. This was a gentleman. He was a priest of the French Pope. Basically, if you remember your schism history from the Great Schism time frame, he was part of he was sent by the French Pope, who the French Pope claimed to be the Pope for Catholicism, even though he wasn't in Rome. There was another Pope in Rome that was competing in things. Fascinating period of Christian history, by the way. But anyways, he was sent by the French Pope to go to send two messages to Ghengis Khan and the other leaders in the Mongol Empire. So the Mongol Empire's pulled back. So Europe's trying to do some diplomatic ties here. And basically what they did is they sent these two messages, and the messages were, Our God is better than your God. Don't come fight us. We'll destroy you. Stay away from our land. And I mean, that's just, I'm sure John's like reading this going, they're going to kill me if I bring these messages. Like, this is like rude to bring these kind of messages. So we don't, we never heard if he actually delivered the actual messages. But he at least gave some semblance of them to the rulers in Mongolia and Karakorum. And then he lived there for a little while among the Mongols and learned from them. And he wrote this letter back. This letter has a lot of information. It's one of the few really good resources we have to understand the Mongols. And he talks about their lifestyle, the kind of clothes they wore, how their family structures worked. And he actually gave a tremendous amount of details into military tactics and strategy that the Mongols had. So a lot of people look at John Carpini and say, in a way, he was a spy for Europe to understand what they're doing, so that if the Mongols came back to Europe, that he could take them out. That Europe would be prepared for the Mongols to come in, basically. So it's really interesting. We played this game where each or our class was divided into 4 groups, and we were 4 different cardinals that had to talk to the French Pope and convince him of what to do about the Mongol horde based on what Carpini sent back. And so one group was to argue, let's attack now, let's destroy them. One was to argue, let's not do anything, let's just kind of hold back and see what happens, how this transpires. Another one says, let's try to convert them to Catholicism, let's do missionary diplomacy type stuff. And the fourth one was like, we need to surrender and just give up. And they were actually spies, Mongolian spies sent to manipulate Europe. So it was just interesting. We had a big debate about these and stuff. It was a really fascinating game we had to play to think through, what do you do? Here you are, you're rulers in Europe. You've just watched the Mongols just destroy everything in their path. And you've got this reprieve moment. Now what do we do about this? And so that was just an interesting debate and discussion that we got into. Oftentimes you hear the word Mongol horde with the Mongols, and it's actually correct term to use. Horde actually means a group of about 1,000 people. And that's what they used for their military they used decimals. So in fractions of 10, like a base 10 type system. So thousands, hundreds, tens, is what you would command. And so a horde is this group, and that's actually where we get the name. I know today being called like a Mongol horde, or being called even just a horde, is somewhat derogatory today, but actually back then it was a correct term to use. The Mongol horde was the Mongol army, basically. So it was really interesting. So anyways, there's probably way more than I needed to say about the Mongols, but it was a fun week. A lot of cool stuff we learned. Let's get into ancient Near East, because we're into Egypt. Egypt is fun. There's a couple of key things to understand about Egyptian history. And if you understand these things, it will help solve a lot of problems in trying to understand Egyptian history, because Egyptian history is rather confusing unless you know these certain things, okay? We have to think about a couple of issues, okay? One is geography. Egypt is primarily centered around the Nile River, okay? We have the Nile River itself, deserts on either side of the Nile, okay? To the west is the Libyan desert, big expanse of nothing, basically. To the east is more desert, but then you also have the Red Sea on the other side of that, a little bit of desert, and then the Red Sea is over there. And then as you get to the north end of Egypt, where the delta is, where it would flood, the inundation place in the alluvial plain of the Nile would spread out. The delta area, very fertile place. And to the east of them is the Levant, which is the other desert, which is the one that the Israelites marched through for 40 years. And it's a formidable desert too. So they had some natural defenses to help with, but most of Egypt takes place right along the Nile River, where it's fertile, where the soil is better. You have water, an unlimited supply of water. The Nile just keeps running, and opportunities. So most of Egypt is right along that Nile. Egypt, you have to realize, is divided into 2 parts. Okay, this is important. Okay, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Okay, Upper Egypt is known as Northern Egypt. Okay, Lower Egypt is, or no, excuse me. Upper Egypt is Southern Egypt. Lower Egypt is northern Egypt, because when we say upper and lower, we're talking about elevation. Okay, the Nile Valley is a unique geological feature because the Nile actually runs downhill to the north. Now that sounds strange. When we think of a river, like especially here in America, we think of rivers from north to south, or from east to west if you're on the west side of the Rockies, and then from west to east if you're on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. Everything goes from the highest point to the lowest point. So that usually means the mountains are more in the north, there's more plains and lower areas in the south, and then the Rockies split it east and west. Okay, that's how we usually think about rivers. But the Nile goes the other direction because the mountains in Africa are in the middle of Africa, and everything north of those mountains gets lower to the Mediterranean. So the Nile actually starts, it originates in the mountains in Central Africa and then runs downhill north. Okay, so when you hear the term Upper Egypt, they're talking elevation, which is the southern part of Egypt. Lower Egypt is the northern part of Egypt where the delta, Nile Delta is. Okay, so you just have to understand that it's a weird way to think about it, but that's how Egyptian geography is set up. So if you remember that, that will help save a lot of problems as you're trying to think about stuff. And someone's like, oh yeah, in Upper Egypt, they did this. You're like, wait, okay, that's the southern part of Egypt, okay? So just remember that. The Nile flows downhill north into the Mediterranean. So that's how it flows. And so you just got to remember that, okay? When it comes to Egypt was divided into two kingdoms for quite a long time before we get into the major dynasties that we famously know of. So there's a lot of prehistory that happens in Egypt, okay? That's when we think of Egypt, we usually think of like pyramids. We think of mummifications. We think of the Sphinx. We think of these ideas and these concepts of, doing all these things. Most of that happens in Middle Kingdom, Old Kingdom time periods. So like 3000 BC to 2000 BC time frame is when a lot of that happens. So we have to be aware, okay, that this is really, really, really old. Most of the things we know of today, that most of the things the average person thinks of when we think of Egyptian history, happened by the time Abraham was alive. So by the time Abraham came around, most of the glory days of Egypt were gone, and Egypt was starting to it was just another country. They weren't a world power anymore. They were just becoming another country and slowly declining after that. And we see them, continuing to get worse and worse as they go on. So most of Egypt's history happens long before most everybody else in the world has their history. They're literally the oldest running continuous nation in the world's history of Egypt, because they started around 3000 BC and they're still around today. So they have a history that spans little over 5,000 years of continuous history. And so Egypt has gone through problems, had to reinvent itself numerous times, but it's still Egypt. It's still here. It's still there. China is probably the only one that you could say has a close, long-running history as Egypt. But China has been broken into different dynasties and nations and stuff, and then reformed. And what we know of China today isn't as old as we think, actually, back from the Qin dynasty. So it's really interesting how Egypt has worked out. Egypt is so unique. Okay, we talked the other week about Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the way my professor talked about this is Mesopotamia was a dumpster fire. Egypt was a campfire. That's a big difference. Egypt was very orderly. It was very neat. Duality is super, super important concept. So water, desert, north, south, upper, lower, life, death. This duality concept was a massive theme through everything in Egypt. There's always this duality because they have to have two sides that oppose each other to gain balance. So this concept like a yin and yang type idea that we hear from Asia, that is like underpins most every philosophy in Egypt, is this yin and yang, trying to find balance in life and everything else. Whereas in Mesopotamia, there was no balance. it was chaotic. Weather would shift. Sometimes you get extreme heat. Sometimes you'd get inundation floods. Sometimes you'd have droughts. It was all over the place. It was really a chaotic place. So it was a very big contrast from Mesopotamia to Egypt on the other side of the desert, basically. So that should help you to start thinking about how old Egypt really is and how crazy this is. Now, if you think about this, a way to kind of try to start to think about timing in Egypt is realize that Cleopatra, who was a female ruler of Egypt, she ruled way towards the very end of Egypt's when Egypt wasn't really much of a world power at all by the time Cleopatra came around, when the Greeks reigned in the Ptolemy phase. Cleopatra, if you look on a time map from Cleopatra to the Wright brothers inventing the airplane, is less time than from Cleopatra to the pyramids. Just to show you how old the pyramids are. Like, they're almost 5,000 years old by themselves, the ancient pyramids. So there's a tremendous longevity of history to understand in Egypt. They had a big thing about life and death. They used cycles of things, life and death. These dualities and things were a big issue, and so that's where a lot of their concepts and things come from. So they were a group of people, mostly living in Upper Egypt. So Southern Egypt is where a lot of people were. There were a few down lower in Lower Egypt, but they weren't quite as developed as the Upper Egypt ones. And then they eventually migrated further north and did things. They had really 3 seasons in Egypt. You have the inundation, which starts about July 19th, like clockwork. In fact, it's the same day, about the same time that the star Sirius comes up, or Sophis is what they would call it. When that star would come up right off the horizon just before sunset, they knew it was time for inundation. So because of all the rains and the snows and stuff would melting in Central Africa, all that water would drain down. There's actually a big lake in the middle of Africa, and that lake drains out into the Nile River, basically. So that would come down to this lake, and then it would run down into the river, and the river would then flood. So the river would suddenly raise, and all of a sudden all the bank areas for about a half a mile or so would just flood and be flooded for a couple months. And so all this silt would come downstream with all of this. This silt was just amazingly fertile, really mineral-rich silt. So it'd come down and it would flood the alluvial plain, the delta. It's called a delta because it looks like a triangle, and the Greek word for triangle is delta. That's where they get it from. The Nile Delta is because the Greeks called it a triangle. So that area would flood. You just get nothing but flood. For a couple months, everything would flood. But what it would do is you'd deposit like a ½ inch to an inch of new soil over everything. And it was highly rich soil. So the farmers would wait. The inundation would happen. So they have nothing to do during inundation. And a lot of scholars believe that's when the pharaohs would hire all the farmers to come build their monuments, to build the temples at Karnak, or to build the pyramids, or to build tombs into the Valley of the Kings and other things like that, the big stelas and the monuments and stuff. During the inundation, the pharaoh would hire everybody to build their monuments. As soon as the inundation was done, then the farmers went back and they would plant. They'd plant all their crops. They'd get them all planted, ready to go, and then they would harvest, basically. And the harvesting time was when everything dried out. So you'd have your inundation, you'd have the wet period for a little bit, and then everything would really dry out, and that was their winter. And so winter was cooler weather, so inundation was summer. Then we think of like fall was when they're planting their crops, and then winter is when they would harvest them and have everything taken care of, and then they'd have the next inundation. So that was their 3 seasons in Egypt, basically. So all of that really drove a lot of the culture, a lot of things that were going on in there. Because of their belief in resurrection, they believed that the Nile was a perfect place. It was the place of the kings. It was an ideal place to live. And so you don't want to be buried anywhere else than the place of the kings. So that's why we don't find Egyptian cemeteries outside of Egypt. When they would have battles, they would bring their troops back home, because in order to be resurrected, to live with the pharaohs and the gods, you had to be buried in the promised land, which is Egypt. Egypt was the place of the gods. And so they always had to stay there. And it was like it says, once they understood beekeeping, once they understood how the inundation would work, and they started to build dams and irrigation areas to get the water to spread out further and do more, life was not that hard in Egypt, because everything just grew and thrived and did really, really well. So Egypt's a fascinating place to study. And we'll give you more details as we get into the kingdoms and some of the rulers and stuff here in the next couple of weeks as well. I know this is getting a little long, sorry. So much fun, so much cool stuff to learn. But let's talk about the interfaith class for a little bit. So if you're interested and want to participate, please message this channel so we can get you on our list to help out. I'm building a series of videos about the title is going to be how to talk to a Muslim if you're a Christian. So it sounds kind of weird, but I want it to kind of stand out. I want it to get you to think a little bit. So the goal of this is we're going to pick like 5 topics, and we're going to talk about these topics. How do the Christians believe about it? How do the Muslims believe about it? What are questions that would be appropriate to ask a Muslim about this topic? So the whole point of this series is to encourage productive dialogue between Christians and Muslims. If all you do is watch the videos, at least you'll start to understand how closely connected, like there's a lot of similarities between Christianity and Islam. And as you understand those similarities, you start to realize they're not so different than us, and that we can bring them together with us, and we can think about things better. Instead of us versus them, it's realizing we're kind of in the same boat. We have a lot of similar beliefs. We have a lot of common ideas we can get along with. Therefore, it makes it easier for me to talk to my coworker who's Muslim, or my neighbor, or the person in the club I'm a member with, or my civic places, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. If I run into somebody who's a Muslim and I'm Christian, I want to have a better conversation with them. These videos will help us in going in that direction. So that when I'm starting to put together the concepts and ideas, we're going to talk about like prayer. We're going to talk about relationships with Jesus, sacred scriptures, connecting with God, those kinds of things. And then we're going to talk, and then I'm going to gather information together. I'm going to put some posts out probably to encourage people to send in some videos of themselves, like what do they think about these ideas and concepts. We'll use those to pull things together to put in the videos. We may do some interviews. We're trying to get how are we going to pull all the content together. Still trying to get all that figured out, but those are things that we're working on. And I think it's going to be a great experience. I think we're going to have a positive opportunity to help people to understand how do we bridge that conversation to start building more interfaith connections with other religions. So if you want to participate, watch for our social media posts on it, and would love to have you contribute. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.